Hello, it's Matt McLachlan. Before we get to this week's podcast, I wanted to extend a very special invitation to you. In August 2025, my signature tour is heading back to the Western Front, and I'd love you to come with me. We're going to explore the battlefields of France and Belgium and tell the entire story of the Australians during the First World War. It's going to be an amazing trip. We're going to visit the Somme, we're going to visit the Ypres Salient, French Flanders, famous battlefields such as Passchendaele, Pozières, Villers-Bretonneux, Bullecourt, Fromelles, and many more. Now, this is the only tour I'm going to personally escort to the Western Front in 2025. So if you'd like to come with me, please don't wait. The tour sells out very, very quickly. It departs Paris on the 30th of August, 2025, and you can find full information at our website, which is battlefields.com.au.
Hey, true crime fans. Tired of ads interrupting your gripping investigations? Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. After all, ads shouldn't be the scariest thing about true crime. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free true crime. That's amazon.com/ad-free true crime to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
A Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello and welcome to Living History and the third episode in our special series about the D-Day landing beaches. If you haven't listened to our excellent episodes with John McManus the last couple of weeks on Omaha and Utah, go back and do that. And of course, like always, if you want to listen to every episode and don't want to wait weekly to hear them, you can subscribe and get all the episodes in one go. I'll put details of that in the show notes so you can subscribe and get all the episodes at once. Today's episode, it's going to be a good one. We're shifting our focus from the Americans to the British and the two British beaches, Gold and Sword. Today, we're doing Gold Beach, and joining me to talk all about it is historian Gary Sheffield. Gary, thank you for coming back on the program.
Thank you for asking me back.
It's a busy time. There's a lot going on about D-Day. There's a lot of interpretations. I mean, after all these years, is there anything new to say about D-Day?
Well, I've actually just finished writing something on D-Day for my forthcoming book, which is a huge book on experience of British and Dominion soldiers across the two world wars. And I looked at D-Day in the context of the experience of amphibious landing. So I included him with Gallipoli and Dieppe. And yes, there is something more to say, not least comparison, but also it's quite a lot of material that has either not been looked at all or only sort of, just picked around by historians. So yeah, I mean, you would have thought that everything had been said, but it's simply not true.
Well, we're going to talk about Gold Beach today in this episode and then come back and do another one on Sword Beach, the two British landing beaches. I want to start this off. Let's do a little bit more background on what the British were thinking and planning before D-Day, because my conversations with John McManus over the last couple of weeks about the American sectors revealed to me that I think even though the Americans had been involved in fighting the Germans up to this point, there was a real feeling with the Americans that they were embarking on a new crusade. It was the start of something big. But my impression from the British is that that wasn't the case, that this was the reckoning that they felt the Germans deserved after, 5 years of war, and after Dunkirk, after the Battle of Britain, after all of these challenges they'd faced, the Blitz and the war they'd been raging against Germans, that this was now time for Germany to receive its comeuppance. So can you talk me a little bit about through what the British were thinking and planning at this stage with D-Day?
Yeah, I think D-Day, or the Second Front, as it was known in Britain, had been thought about, argued for years by this point. Ever since that Britain had been forced out of Europe in 1940 at Dunkirk and the other evacuations, there was a sense that they would have to return to France at some stage. Now, of course, there's a lot of fighting goes on against the Germans between Dunkirk and D-Day, in the desert, in Italy, commando raids, things elsewhere. But there's still a sense that this is actually looming on the horizon. And this is not something that Winston Churchill and many of the senior British generals are that keen on doing, because they are all, I think, influenced by the memories of the First World War, particularly by Gallipoli. And there is a sense that they fear the worst. And one of the results of this is that there is a huge amount of preparation put into place for the landings. I must say, I've been really impressed by the sheer level of expertise and effort people have put in, particularly compared to Dieppe only two years earlier. But there is an argument that they actually are so focused on getting onto the beaches and off the beaches that they don't think too much about what's going to happen next. And so, in a sense, I think the British armies are unprepared for the fighting which takes place inland from Normandy, which maybe we can talk about on another occasion. But I think that everything is being focused on getting the troops ashore. It's also worth pointing out what sort of army the British Army is in June 1944. 2 points I would make, among many I could. First of all, it's a wasting asset. The British population of 45 billion, something like that, is sustaining 3 major land campaigns in the Mediterranean, just about to start northwest Europe, also the war against Japan. It's got a very large air force, particularly bomber command, much larger than the equivalent in the First World War, large navy, and basically the British are running out of men. And I think there is a sense that this is a one shot, that actually the British must get it right. And one of the things which Montgomery has been criticised, Montgomery, of course, is the commander of 21st Army Group, the senior land commander for the D-Day invasions, is that he's too cautious. There are very good reasons for that. And what I think principal one is he knows if he loses this army, he's not going to get another one. And so Stephen Hart, former colleague of mine at Sandhurst, made very good point some 20-odd years ago, that actually if Britain ends up on the winning side, still has an army worthy of the name in terms of numbers, to give Britain a place at the top table post-war, that is a success. So not surprisingly, Montgomery is cautious in hoarding manpower. And again, it's a reaction against the First World War. He had been through First World War battles. No one really wanted to go through that all that again. The second point is that the British Army in 1944 is basically an army of civilians in uniform. So, for example, 3rd Division, which lands at Sword Beach on D-Day, nominally a regular division of professional soldiers. It had been Montgomery's division in the Dunkirk campaign of 1940. Actually, very, very few professional soldiers left in it. These are blokes who have been called up out of civil life and are there to do a job, I think, to fight and go home. They lack the fanaticism of some of their opponents. They're the quintessential citizen soldiers. Say much the same about the Canadians, although they're all volunteers. British are largely conscripts, and the Americans as well. So this is a force of essentially civilians in uniform in the British Army, which is launched against Germany on 6th of June 1944.
Gary, something that I think is really fascinating you mentioned there is the long shadows of the First World War, and really two key developments that took place during the First World War that obviously chastened the British and scared them somewhat as to what they were going to face going back to France. The first, you mentioned the Gallipoli campaign, which was up until World War II the largest amphibious invasion ever launched, but also stalemate on the Western Front. And there must, I mean, that combination, they had both going on here at Normandy. And for so many of the commanders who'd been veterans of the First World War, it must have been terrifying. The thought that the landing could go wrong as Gallipoli had gone wrong. And then even if they got ashore, what would stop France turning into the Western Front of the First World War, where the Germans were dug in, the Allies were dug in, and no one was going anywhere? Have you seen evidence that the commanders were openly plotting to try and overcome these issues?
Absolutely. There's a huge sense of relief once the troops are ashore. And essentially, the plan they come up with to get the troops ashore is to provide absolutely massive firepower as the troops come ashore, whether it be from the air, ships up to and including battleships, pounding the beaches, pounding the gun emplacements. Rockets mounted on landing craft, they're coming in. Even the field artillery are firing basically from the sea at the beaches as they come in. Now, their chances of actually hitting anything, the 25-pounders and what have you, is absolutely minimal. But the point is that this is something that's recognised very clearly by 1944 as a result of not only Gallipoli but earlier amphibious operations like Husky, the landings in Sicily in 43, is actually you can't possibly kill or maim every single defender. What you can do is make them keep their heads down, not fire their weapons at the enemy. And so that is in the end what actually happens. There are occasions of some troops, certainly British and Canadians, the ones I know best, who are deeply disappointed that they've got any opposition at all firing at them. But in fact, the Allied bombardment does enough to ensure that the Allies can get ashore in sufficient numbers. Also, something which I think is really important to mention here is the British come up with a plan that's fundamentally that, unlike at Gallipoli, where the infantry land, supported by naval gunfire support, as far as possible at D-Day, it will be armour. It will be machines that does the initial fighting. Hence, you have a heavy investment in specialised armour, the Averies, armoured vehicles, Royal Engineers, which are things like mine-clearing tanks and so on and so forth. Also, the DDs, the duplex drive swimming Shermans. So basically, the idea is that the infantry don't arrive on the beach unsupported. Now, in the event, particularly at Gold Beach, the weather is so bad that actually the infantry and armour sort of arrives mixed up, and you don't have that approach of the armour landing first. But that's the idea behind it. It's a very, very different concept from Gallipoli. Also, from the Americans up at Utah and Omaha. But it's not an original point by any means, but it's been said that whereas in the First World War the British fought steel with flesh, not entirely true, but nonetheless there's enough truth in it to make it worth saying. In the Second World War, the British are fighting steel with steel, and that's the difference.
Well, let's talk specifically about these landings, Gary. Let's talk about Gold Beach. Let's start with the terrain, because the thing that fascinates me about all of the D-Day landing beaches is how different they seem from one another, even though they're all along the same stretch of coast. It seems like every landing beach was its own unique battle. So paint us a picture of what the Allies were facing at Gold Beach.
Okay, well Gold Beach is a stretch of land. It's about, 8-10 miles long, something like that. At one end, the western end, there's a lot of very high cliffs. Now, the British don't attempt to attack them. It means that actually all of the landings take place at the eastern end. Anybody who has been to the Normandy beaches has probably been up onto the cliffs above Arromanches, which is a key little port. Of course, becomes the site of the British Mulberry Harbour, the artificial harbour, and you have a very commanding view from those cliffs down onto the beach. You go a bit further along, and actually the beach is relatively flat and relatively easy to get ashore. And so the British, when planning the operation at Gold, decide that they're going to put everything into landing on the easy bit, which is an obvious decision to make, but nonetheless it's one that they have the option of taking. Unlike Omaha, where, of course, the Americans basically are landing on a beach that's dominated by cliffs everywhere, the British at Gold don't have that problem.
And given the nature of the terrain and the somewhat easier aspect at the eastern end, how did the Germans defend against the landing?
Well, the Germans, their troops in Normandy are not first-class troops. They have one particular division, the 352nd Division, which is inserted into Normandy shortly before D-Day. It's actually not picked up properly by Allied intelligence. But they're the ones that tend to be up against the Americans. They're slightly better class troops. The British in the main are up against the 716 Infantry Division, which are not first-class troops. I mean, basically, the higher the number of the division, the poorer the quality they are. And there's a significant number of the troops opposite the British, nominally German, are in fact Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, ex-prisoners of war from the Eastern Front, in other words, who've actually ended up fighting for the Germans. There's not a high level of enthusiasm there, though, of course, they actually do have German NCOs and officers who can be quite ruthless in making them fight. So actually the quality of the German troops up against the British at Golden Sword isn't brilliant. Nonetheless, enough of them fight to make it a very, very hard job indeed. In preparing for this, I did a bit of Googling, as one does, and I came across an American website which said, quote, that 3 D-Day beaches, Utah, Gold, and Sword were, quote, easy. No, they weren't. There was tough fighting on all of them. No, they didn't have the same sort of setbacks as the Americans did on Omaha. Canadians had of the 3 Anglo-Canadian beaches, I think the Canadian 3rd Division at Juneau had the toughest fight, but Gold and Sword were not easy. There was a lot of fighting, and some of it was quite bitter.
Jewelry isn't a gift you give just once. It's a way to remind your loved one of a beautiful moment every time they see it. Blue Nile can help you find the gift that says how you feel and says it beautifully, with expert guidance and a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Go to BlueNile.com and experience the convenience of shopping Blue Nile, the original online jeweler since 1999. That's BlueNile.com to find the perfect jewelry gift for any occasion. BlueNile.com.
When it comes to weight loss, no 2 people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
You mentioned, Gary, when you were describing that layout, the cliffs at one end, and so the British were going to focus on the eastern end, which was somewhat easier country. And once again, going back to that Gallipoli analogy, it really demonstrates how much we had learnt in amphibious operations since then, because it seems that the concept on D-Day, the concept of landing in Normandy was to simply get ashore on these beaches. You didn't have to have allies on every stretch of sand. You simply had to get ashore, establish a beachhead, and then start moving inland, and then those beachheads could link up. Is that a fair assessment of the Allied plans?
Up to a point, but what I will say is that the Allies in the First World War did pretty badly in the landings, the initial landings of Gallipoli, 25th of April 1915. Don't need to tell an Australian that. But actually, they then learned the lessons. And so the landings on 6th of August, we won't get into drinking tea on the beach and all the rest of it, which is a myth. But actually, the way the landings were carried out actually were rather more effective. And it's pretty clear that they learned lessons from them. So, for example, there's a planned amphibious landing on the coast of Belgium, planned for 1917. Never actually takes place, but the level of planning and preparation is quite impressive, and clearly they have learned lessons. And throughout the interwar period, they're building on these lessons of Gallipoli. Then things go wrong. They basically forget the lessons learned so painfully. And so you have the disaster of Operation Jubilee, Canadians being launched, Canadians and British being launched at Dieppe in August 1942, which basically ignore all the lessons of Gallipoli and other operations. They then painfully relearn those in the Mediterranean operations But by the spring of 1944, I think the Allies have once again grasped the nettle. And as far as what they need to do once they get ashore, gold is really, the objectives are very, very straightforward. They need to strike west. It's British 50th Division, the Tyne Tees Division, recruited, at least nominally, from the north of England. They need to strike west to link up with the American forces at Omaha. They need to move inland and capture Bayeux, which is a beautiful, small medieval city, and it's key communication choke point. They need to capture the small port on Bessin, where a Royal Marine Commando is sent off in that direction. And they also need to go east to link up with the Canadians at Juno. And so the point is that it's not simply getting ashore, it's getting ashore and push inland, take objectives. And that's a lesson that's been learned really, really clearly, I think, from Gallipoli and indeed from other operations.
Well, tell us how it all went, Gary. What did the British face when they came ashore at Gold Beach?
Okay, well, the first thing to say is the operation, as for all the Allied landings on D-Day, is launched in what you might call suboptimal weather. The sea's quite rough. Many of the troops are seasick as they come across. In fact, some of them claim to have been so glad to get off the boat they'd rather face German machine gun fire and mortar fire on the beaches than put up with going up and down being sick any longer. And the bombardment, I think, is pretty effective. At Long-sur-Mer, there's a major battery of 4 guns manned by German sailors, as it happens. Their guns taken off of redundant German destroyers. And these are engaged by Royal Navy ships and some American ships. And basically, they are effectively neutralized. Now, that's not to say they're all destroyed. What it means is, as I said earlier, that the gunners are very reluctant to open fire. Because if they do, they get a lot of grief coming in their direction. And that's generally the pattern across Gold Beach. The Hamel strong point, which is one particular place which actually is attacked heavily by the air forces beforehand, is pretty well unscathed. And so when the troops come ashore, there's a series of very tough fights. And what we see, actually, is the infantry and the specialised armour coming ashore all mixed up. And there's a lot of improvisation going on the beach. So, for example, at the Hamel strong point, eventually it's only silenced at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when an Avary, an armoured vehicle Royal Engineers tank, fires a flying dustbin, is what it was nicknamed, a petard mortar round, a huge great thing on the front of a tank, which actually finally it goes into its rear entrance and silences it. And at La Riviere, there's another casemate which has got an 88mm gun, typically lethal gun. That's actually neutralised by a tank at 7:30 in the morning. The troops that come ashore, for example, the Royal Hampshires and the Dorsets and the East Yorkshires do get in some very tough fighting, but actually by early afternoon they've actually captured most of their objectives and they're starting to push inland. And this, I think, is critical. And actually, going back to my initial point about what's the plan of the operation? It's not merely to get ashore; it's to get ashore and then move inland. And so, by the afternoon, the British are starting to get on board, to get inland. Just to give a sense of how tough the fighting is, it's worth mentioning the only Victoria Cross won on D-Day is won by Company Sergeant Major Stan Hollis of the 6th Green Howards. Now, this is a territorial battalion, at least nominally, so it's not a regular battalion. Most of the soldiers are are civilians in uniform. And one of the things which has fascinated me in doing my work on my current book, and there's an awful lot of examples of this at D-Day, and indeed some of the other operations, is that in the era of the two world wars, we're talking about mass industrialized warfare, in which we're talking about vast numbers of guns, tanks, bombs, and yet there's still a really important role for low-level leadership. And I've not really come up with a satisfactory term to describe what these people do. I've been using the term big man, which is a term that's been used by John Keegan in his writing, and originally comes from sociology. Now, big doesn't refer to physical size in this this example. It's someone who's prepared to stand up under fire and actually make a difference. And Stan Hollis is one of these people. He's 31 years old on D-Day, and so therefore he will be regarded as being one of the old men of the unit. He's been fighting since El Alamein, so he's actually someone who's actually had a lot of experience. Certainly, if you ever look at a photo of Stan Hollis on D-Day, age 31, he looks at least 10 years older. I think that's partly because he was from a fairly deprived background in the north of England. He'd grown up during the Great Depression. It must be said that he's not a great advertisement for the fitness of British soldiers in 1944, and yet he's the sort of man who will stand up and actually fight. It's been said that he actually had a personal grudge against the Germans. So when they land on Gold Beach on D-Day, the troops under his command come under fire from a pillbox in a garden wall. And he doesn't hesitate. He races some 30 yards towards this pillbox and basically shoves his Sten gun in through the slit and just hoses it and just neutralizes the pillbox. He then drops a grenade through the pillbox and, takes the surviving occupants prisoner. So it's all sort of boys' own paper stuff. Point is not simply to highlight his remarkable heroism. That's certainly true. It's that he's the sort of man who makes things happen at a time when civilian soldiers might think, oh, maybe I'll keep my head down, go to ground. No, Stan Hollis pushes forward. He then carries out another amazing act of heroism a few hours later, further inland near Crépol, very near where the memorial to the Green Howards on D-Day is to this day. And basically, he has another incredible act of heroism, rescuing two soldiers and bringing them back to the main body. For that, he gets a Victoria Cross, a very well-deserved Victoria Cross. My point is that there are dozens, scores, maybe hundreds of these sorts of actions, maybe not quite as showy, maybe not quite as Victoria Cross material, but all sorts of things like this are going on along all of the landing beaches as these key men, these big men, get up, motivate their soldiers, get them forward, get a civilian army actually into action. These are the people, as well as their formal leaders, their NCOs and their officers, who make things happen. And I think Stan Hollis, who wins the VC for his actions, stands as a, albeit extreme, example of quite a common phenomena on D-Day.
Well, Gary, I think you and I have talked about this before. I know it's something that interests us, but the human experience of being in a war. And I think it's fairly safe to say that even if you look at the broad picture of a beach like Gold and say the Allies got ashore fairly swiftly and didn't come under too much fire and didn't suffer too many casualties, each man was fighting his own war. And as we've said before, each man's war is the 6 feet in front of him. And when you tell a story like Stan Hollis taking on German pillboxes single-handedly, you certainly wouldn't say that his escapades were easy in any sense at all coming ashore there. One of the things that struck me is when I spoke to John McManus about the American beaches, Omaha and Utah, the description we basically followed was that the landings were eventually successful in spite of how the plan went wrong, that lots of things didn't go according to plan, and the landings were defined by adaptability, improvisation by men on the ground, and really just overcoming challenges as they presented themselves. Was the landing at Gold Beach in the same vein, or did everything go mostly according to plan?
Well, no, it didn't go according to plan, not least because the serials got mixed up because of the bad weather. So it's supposed to be led by specialised armour. The specialised armour turned up late, mixed in with the infantry, all sorts of things. The amphibious tanks, the duplex drive Shermans of the 4th, 7th Dragoon Guards, most of them were actually landed directly onto the beach rather than actually swimming inland, or those that did swim inland actually came in from much closer in. So the whole thing was mixed up. What I will say is on Gold Beach, there is enough flexibility built into the plan actually to make things work. And the chaos is pretty considerable if you're there, but actually it's not so great to completely overwhelm it. Just to give one example of this, that one of the key aspects of the plan is that 4-7 Royal Marine Commando is to land and then march off to Port-en-Bessin, which is this little port a little way from Gold Beach. It's going to be captured because it's going to be a key logistic hub for the Allies. And because they're late getting ashore, they're landed some way from where they're supposed to be. That's true of a lot of the troops at Gold, by the way. By the time they actually get off the beach, they're supposed to capture Port-en-Bessin on D-Day. Actually, they arrive there when it's too late to make an attack. So they dig in on the night of the 6th of June and actually carry out the attack and capture it in the fighting on the 2 days that follow, the 7th and 8th of June. So the plan doesn't work according to how it's got to, but there's enough flexibility built into it. Also, I think the Germans are pretty overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the attack and the sheer volume of stuff falling out of the sky on them, the firepower and the large numbers of troops that have got ashore. So I must say, up against a stronger, more cohesive enemy, the Allies might have struggled a bit more, but in the end, they do just enough just in time, and the Germans, I think, are genuinely shocked by the sheer weight of firepower brought up against them. I suspect John McManus made this point, but the ability of the Allies to project firepower in land, both from the air and from the sea, is absolutely critical. So this is very much, maybe it's the last hurrah of the Royal Navy. It's a multinational. So I won't say last hurrah, I'll get in trouble with naval people for that. It's a really major effort in the Second World War of the Royal Navy. So the naval force is multinational, but it's dominated by the British. And the British are able to bring up battleships and cruisers, which actually have the ability to project fire, many, many miles inland. And actually one of the reasons why the Germans, at least some of them anyway, are very wary about committing their armour on D-Day is the knowledge that actually they can get really roughed up by 15-inch shells being fired by a battleship on shore. And of course, given the fact that you've got domination of the air by the Allies, which allows spotting for the ships, doesn't work perfectly in every example by any means, but nonetheless, it is pretty important. It's not simply the weight of troops coming ashore on the beaches, it's actually the ability to project firepower from the sea and from the air inland, which is absolutely critical. So this is genuinely what we today call in military terms a joint operation. It's not an army operation backed up by the Navy and the Air Force. All three elements, land, sea and air, have an absolutely vital and complementary role.
The landings took place, I think, at about 7:30 in the morning at Gold Beach. In your opinion, Gary, at what stage of the day could the British say that Gold Beach was safely under control?
It's actually 7:25 when the landings take place. It's an hour later than the American landings for the simple reason that the tides are different. We're only talking about a few miles down the coast. But and there's another fact that's, I think, often underappreciated, the sheer technical difficulty of making in naval terms of actually making a landing like this. We're really talking about early afternoon by the time that the Allies are getting troops ashore in very large numbers and actually getting a very strong foothold on continental Europe. Having said that, there's quite bitter fighting going on throughout the rest of the day. Not everywhere is cleared as quickly as everywhere else. There's quite a lot of fighting as German strong points are cleared up, for example, later. But yeah, we're talking about early afternoon that there's a strong foothold on Gold.
Well, Gary, it's an amazing story, the landing at Gold Beach. Sometimes, I'll say this from an Australian perspective, sometimes overshadowed by what the Americans were doing, particularly at Omaha. But it is an amazing story, and you've presented a very compelling account of what the British did there. So I really do appreciate your insights into the whole thing. We're going to come back next week and talk about Sword Beach, and again, a very different story from what happened at Gold. Each one of these beaches, its own little adventure all in its own right. But Gary, thank you so much for joining us to talk about Gold Beach today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and visit livinghistorytv.com for more great history content.
At Leidos, a brilliant mind is smart, but a brilliant team is smarter. A ship that finds enemy subs is smart, but an autonomous fleet, that's smarter. Defending against cyber attacks? Smart. Stopping attacks before they start? Smarter. And using AI tools is smart. But integrating trusted mission AI into your technology is smarter. We're not just making technology solutions in national security and health. We're making smart smarter. Leidos.